pleasure to be back here, and it's wonderful to see so many people at reSITE this year. So I want to talk about three places, as Martin said. We could be talking about many places when we're talking about migration and its effects. I think last time I was here I might have mentioned Zaatari, the refugee camp in Syria, across the border from Syria in Jordan, which has become a kind of pop-up city and raises all sorts of interesting issues. This time I'd like to talk about migration in a different way, though, and I'd like to suggest ways in which migration is both an opportunity and a challenge. And by challenge, I mean not just a social and economic challenge, but an environmental one, in many cases inseparable from that other great issue of our day, climate change. So the first place is Stuttgart, that's Stuttgart, which is synonymous with German know-how and corporate giants like Porsche, Bosch, and Daimler. It illustrates, I think, a positive model of historic integration, and Saskia alluded to Germany in this context, and I think it's in part been driving Angela Merkel's agenda. There, migration is widely viewed as an engine of economic growth, and integration is part of the bedrock of civic pride. The problem Stuttgart faces today are ones that Germany in general and prosperous cities across Europe and elsewhere share: a dearth of affordable housing, an aging population, and the need for skilled labor. When I went to Stuttgart not so long ago, I met Gary Pavkovic, the son of a Croatian guest worker who emigrated in the 1980s. Gary manages immigration for the city government. He ticked off some numbers for me. 40% of Stuttgart's residents, 60% of people under the age of 18 come from abroad. That's twice the national average. After World War II, foreign laborers rebuilt local industry. First the Italians, then the Greeks, Spaniards, Yugoslavians, Turks. Now some 20,000 newcomers arrive annually, and that's not counting the current waves of Syrians and others. Immigration today accounts for 1 out of every 3 startups in the city. The percentage of entrepreneurs in Stuttgart with migrant backgrounds is the highest in all of Germany. And we're talking about IT people, engineers, architects, artists. Boom towns are immigration towns, as Pavkovic put it. I toured a disused tank factory now being converted into an arts complex. The man who bought it was born in Turkey and owns a bakery across the street next to a big Turkish supermarket and mosque. And of course, there are countless doctors and business people and factory workers who come from elsewhere whom you don't see at street level in shop windows. Stuttgart's big move years ago, I believe, was to avoid pushing migrants into poor, isolated suburbs, as in Rome or Paris. Stuttgart doesn't really have ethnic enclaves, and this absence of separation promotes integration. After the Second World War, Mercedes and Bosch erected these hostels for guest workers, but by the 1970s, when Manfred Rommel became mayor, political and business leaders actively mixed migrants into existing communities in the city center, pushing a melting pot brand of urbanism. Wilfried Port is a member of the Daimler board and director of the company's labor relations, with whom I also met when I was there. And he remembered for me Stuttgart years ago as a very dour place. He said, then the Italians and Spaniards and Turks brought cafe life to the city. Physically, tangibly, this became a much friendlier, more open city. So the big challenge there remains housing. Social and urban change go together, is what Isabel Faeser, who's the deputy mayor in Stuttgart, told me. In this city, she said, we kind of have lots of practice integrating people and have had few migrant-specific problems as a result. But if we can't house everybody, then we will have social problems. Housing is the #1 issue, is what she said. The migrants, and this is her phrase, are both a challenge and an opportunity. And that's true nearly everywhere. Saskia talked about migrants coming from rural areas where the economies and villages have been upended by businesses, political turmoil, and climate change. They also come to cities, of course, for opportunity, not just Stuttgart. The next place I want to talk about is Mexico City, where mass migration of peoples from other parts of Latin America and from the Mexican countryside across 5+ decades or more has created a megalopolis of spectacular vitality and instability. And there, water encapsulates the challenge. Water's unfair and irregular distribution, and climate change adds what I would call a kind of existential threat to the city. The city occupies what was originally a network of lakes, as you may know, in a mile-plus high valley. The valley is an endorheic, or a closed basin, meaning water doesn't drain naturally from it. The Aztecs who first settled there lived with nature. The conquering Spaniards waged war against water. Spanish authorities replaced Aztec dikes and canals with streets and squares. They drained lakes and cleared forests, determined to subdue nature, instead suffering flood after flood, including one in 1629 that basically drowned the city for 4 years. The Aztecs managed, as one expert there put it to me, but they had 300,000 people. We now have 21 million. And what I'm showing you here in this slide, of course, is one of the results of fighting nature. You see this is the curve of the cornice and the buildings comes from subsidence. The city is literally sinking from draining the water underneath itself. During the last century, when for a while thousands of newcomers were arriving in Mexico every single day, Mexico's growth, we're talking about going from 30 square miles in 1950 to 3,000 square miles in 2010. This has produced this metropolis of mostly unplanned and informal development, wiping out nearly every remaining trace of the lakes, depleting the aquifers, straining an already aged and inadequate infrastructure, and forcing what had been a water-rich valley to import billions of gallons of water from far away, a crazy feat that is partly a consequence of the fact that the city, high up in the mountains, has no large-scale operation for recycling wastewater or collecting rainwater, expelling 200 billion gallons of both via overtaxed, broken sewers. The system incredibly squanders more than 40% of the water running through its 8,000 miles of pipes due to leaks and pilferings, stealing. It's said that pumping the water up a mile to Mexico City consumes as much energy as does the entire city of Puebla, which has a population roughly the size of Paris's. Water does reach wealthy residents in the west of Mexico City who can water their lawns. So tourists and many others miss the scale of the problem. Some 70% of people in Mexico City can count on using their taps, their faucets, 12 hours a day, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of poor city residents wait days or even weeks for an hour of yellow muck to drip from their faucets, if they can expect any water at all. These are pictures taken at a pumping station along the Grand Canal, which was one of the great infrastructural projects Mexico built at the end of the 19th century, a sewer, and the sewer has collapsed because the city is collapsing, and so these pumps have had to be installed to literally pump water up to the drains to get it out of the city. Now, climate change did not cause Mexico City's water problems, as it did not cause pollution or sprawl, but temperatures have been rising. Climate change is accelerating what the Aztecs started when the Aztec settlers put the city on a lake bed. More heat and increased periods of drought mean more evaporation, sinking water tables, and more demand for water, which puts yet more pressure on the city to pump deeper and deeper from its aquifers, worsening subsidence. It's a vicious cycle. Forecasts predict climate change will bring not just hotter days, but more sporadic rainfall, along with more frequent droughts. We are better prepared than we used to be for floods, but not for drought. We are totally unprepared for that, is what Ramon Aguirre, the director of the water system of Mexico City, told me. If we have the problems that California and Sao Paulo have recently there is a serious possibility of unrest, he said. I liken climate change to an approaching storm aimed at what is most vulnerable and fragile in any city, exposing structures that are failing, exposing squalid politics, exposing historic urban weaknesses. I include this photograph because, speaking of urban weaknesses, this is the same pumping station. This is an open sewer, and that's a housing project that's built 50 meters away. Talking about bad urban planning. Climate change, I think, goes hand in hand with bad urban planning. The fact that so much, in Mexico's case, so much porous land, including large stretches of what Mexico City had designated for agriculture and preservation, called conservation land, has been developed anyway and is now buried beneath concrete and asphalt, stopping rain from reaching the aquifers, promoting heat islands that raise temperatures and only increase the demand for water. I went to see a well in the district of Tlalpan where water trucks called pipas were loaded for deliveries to households that didn't get water. In Iztapalapa, an informal settlement now, part of the city, with 1.8 million people, almost all of them migrants, residents have to wait in line overnight to plead with drivers of these trucks, who sometimes pit these desperate families against one another, seeing who will pay the bigger bribe to get water. In Tlalpan, by contrast, the system is less chaotic, but on the receiving end of the pipas, it can be a nightmare. So deliveries are sometimes promised between 3 and 30 days, forcing residents to stay at home the whole time because orders will be canceled if there's no one in the house when the trucks arrive. Water takes over women's lives in places where there is a serious problem. I met a woman named Virginia Josefina Ramirez Granillo. She was an elderly resident in Iztapalapa, and she said to me, we line up at 3 in the morning for the pipa. We wait for hours to get water that doesn't last a week, and usually there aren't enough pipas. Sometimes there's violence. Women sell their spaces in the line. If you're from the wrong political party, you don't get water. You have to show your party affiliation, your voting ID. There are places where the pipas don't arrive at all, where all the precariousness of the water system, and by extension the entire inequitable city, collide in a few hectares. In the highlands of the district of Xochimilco in the city, where the roads rise almost vertically, dirt byways lead to these shanties made of corrugated tin and cinder block. And there, one day, I found Diana Contreras Guzman, a single mother whose life revolves around water. She has to lug hundreds of liters by hand up and down the hill just outside her house, making sure not to be gone too long so that no one steals her water. And she also pays a neighbor who owns 2 donkeys to deliver water to her because she can't carry enough herself. Guzman's family of 9 lives in a single-room shack, and the family earns, I calculated, about $600 a month, spending more than 10% of its income just for water, enough to yield 10 gallons per person per day. To give you a sense of that, the average resident in Prague or New York City consumes about 100 gallons per person per day and pays 1/10 of what Guzman pays for 1/10 the amount of water. Is there any clear indication that everything about water in Mexico City comes down to inequity? Meanwhile, the Mexican federal government promotes highways and cars. This is Guzman's shack. The city is building a whole new network of elevated highways, even as it touts rapid bus service and bike sharing. There has to be a consensus of scientists, politicians, engineers, and society when it comes to pollution, water, climate. These are the words of Claudia Sheinbaum, who is a former environment minister there. She said to me, we have the resources, but we lack the political will. So that's also the case in my last example, which is the complex megacity that occupies the Pearl River Delta in South China. namely Guangzhou, this is Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Dongguan, the largest urban agglomeration in the world, according to the World Bank. In all, the area produces more than 1/3 of China's GDP, well over $1 trillion a year, several trillion actually. We're talking about 120 million people in the whole Pearl River Delta. Overwhelmingly, this is a migrant population. Shenzhen was a fishing village of just 30,000 people in 1979 when Deng Xiaoping declared it a new special economic zone. Now its population is nearly 11 million people, dwarfing New York in 35 years. Guangzhou had 1.87 million people in 1980. Now it has 14.5 million people. These are people who move from the countryside, migrants, arriving by the millions to work in the factories that produce everything, your phone, your computer, your watch, your car, the springs in your ballpoint pen, your t-shirts and underwear and socks, the containers and ships that move all these goods around the world. The whole global economy, pretty much, depends on this region, its productivity and welfare. It is perhaps the most spectacular urban revolution in human history, but it has come at a heavy cost. And I'm not just talking about notorious Chinese labor practices. I'm also talking about reckless urban growth, toxic air pollution, and lack of services. Economic development trumped everything in China, including for the migrant workers themselves, until they began, during the last few years, to gain some wealth. Wages for factory workers rose from $100 US a month to $800, and so they have begun to organize themselves and petition for quality of life improvements, starting with cleaner air, better public transit, like the rapid bus service here in Guangzhou, and also in response to mounting pressure along the global supply chain from international businesses whose goods are manufactured in China and who answer to a carbon-conscious clientele. China finally started paying more than lip service to issues like air quality. As with the rapid growth of the cities in the first place, China's turnaround on this issue has been fairly astounding, I think. The country still builds one coal-fired powered plant a week on average, but it has promised to cap its CO2 emissions by 2030. It's finally begun to enforce national and local pollution reduction benchmarks and is now the world's leading investor in solar and wind power. Can the country move quickly enough to cope with the looming issue, and that is climate change? It took China years to acknowledge air pollution was a real problem. By the way, this is a subway. These are videos, but I don't think I can make them go. But this was in Guangzhou not so long ago. It's kind of amazing to see, actually, just water flowing down the steps. Climate change, and by that I mean rising seas, fresh water contamination from the ocean, drought and flooding. Climate change is not something the Chinese talk seriously about yet. But as with Mexico City, it is inextricable from the challenges that go along with migration, sprawl, inequity. Most of development in the Pearl River Delta lies within a meter of sea level. The World Bank estimates that sea level will reduce China's GDP by up to 10.8%, much of that coming from South China. So we're talking about trillions of dollars at stake. Rising seas mean floods. This is also a street in Guangzhou, which was a video, trust me. And as I said, rising seas push, and storm surges push salt water into the river, the Pearl River, and the Delta, endangering the area's food and fresh water supplies. Rising temperatures mean greater risks of disease like dengue fever, which, as you may know, have plagued Guangzhou, which was also the source of SARS disease. Urban planning, or the lack of it, as I said, has exacerbated China's problems. Cities like Guangzhou and Shenzhen are car-centric, with overscaled highways and boulevards and massive office towers and apartment blocks that create heat islands, block critical breezes from cooling off sweltering cities, and require people to drive. Greenways are badly connected to the daily network of busy streets and transit. Guangzhou's metro system, I showed you that picture before, only got started in 1997. Shenzhen's, this is Shenzhen, in 2004. They have each grown to include hundreds of stations covering hundreds of kilometers. They are, I took this picture the other day. I don't know, it just seemed like a funny thing, but this was the Shenzhen Subway. These metro systems are among, let's face it, the most amazing infrastructural accomplishments of the modern age. New York, by comparison, has built one new subway station in the last 60 years. But even so, the systems are not keeping up with growth. And in Shenzhen, much of this growth is landfill, replacing what had been mangroves that acted as crucial buffers to the sea. Only 30% of the area's mangroves remain, leaving vast stretches of economically developed waterfront vulnerable to rising seas. That's the same view, basically. So there are challenges, but I think climate change is also an opportunity for China. Jobs and factories are now leaving the Pearl River Delta for countries like Vietnam and Laos with lower labor costs and environmental standards. And in response, the Chinese can channel, I think, the same energy that built these cities in the first place into cornering the global market in cutting-edge green technology. And they can do the same with climate adaptation. They can lead the world in recuperating coastline, promoting mass transit, retrofitting factories for offices to cut down on sprawl, retrofitting streets to return bikes to the transit network, designing dikes and water retention systems, as in the Netherlands, that produce and promote equity, healthy development, and public safety. Climate change solutions, of course, involve long-term investments. Ma Jun is a Chinese environmental activist who told me, in China, local pollution, water, air, soil, are posing serious and direct challenges to people. It's right in their face, he said. It's about the food they put on their tables. On the other hand, climate change is happening at a different speed. Well, this is true outside China as well. And the question becomes how to translate adaptation into an economic reward, as with the whole migrant question in general. How can a greener supply chain become an economic edge, as with the migration question? I was encouraged by what I saw there and by the fact that the Chinese have lately reversed themselves and taken up the issue of carbon emissions, opening the door to change. Let's acknowledge also that an autocratic regime that doesn't permit people to vote has the singular advantage of being able to commit to large-scale long-term investments without worrying about the next election or quarterly earnings reports. We're back to where we started in Stuttgart, I think, with the migrants, seeing potential opportunity where others see a threat. In the end, I would just say there are no easy solutions when it comes to either migration or climate change, but I also believe there is no question about what is right and necessary. Thank you.